talk here about miracles. Now, one article I wrote about this is on our website. One of the over 8,000 articles we have on the site is creation.com/miracles. It's quite easy to remember that, I'd imagine, about this. Now, one thing I'm not going to talk about is the charismatic versus cessationist issue, okay? That's not within the scope of our ministry, so I won't answer questions about that in the panel discussion tomorrow either, okay? It's about whether we can believe in miracles, that God has done miracles and still be a scientist, still believe in science as well as miracles. Now, one thing is to define the terms, and I'd say that miracle is an extraordinary intervention by God in the world, and I prefer to regard miracles as additions to the normal laws of nature. I mean, some people say they're violations. I think they're actually on top of the normal laws of nature rather than violations of them. And the Bible certainly talks about miracles, but in fact, when you look through the Bible, you'll find that most of the Bible doesn't have that much in the way of miracles. There's certain special periods of miracles where we have God, certain very important actions in history as he furthers the outworking of his messianic plan through history. And there's certain definite stages where he authenticates the prophets and the great leaders like Moses by acting miraculously, but most of the time in the Bible, there isn't that much in the way of what we call miracles. Certainly God is working through the actions of the Bible. Still, God is in control throughout. But miracles are not the only way he can control things. So let's look at some of these occurrences. Obviously, the very important one is the creation of the world in 6 ordinary days. Now, this is certainly nothing, this is not ordinary actions of nature. This is supernature going on here. And of course, as we know, he took 6 days. There's no reason why he had to take so long. But of course, the 6 days was a pattern for our working week. That's the whole point of it. That's why he spread the creative acts over so many days. And the Bible, of course, gives us a definite order of his creative acts. There's actually a history there. And that was what I think is one of the weaknesses of the intelligent design movement. It lacks this biblical history of creative acts and the fall and the flood. And of course, we see things like Exodus. You got miracles of nature. Here's the beginning of Moses. Moses was the one who wrote the law, and of course, God authenticated Moses' authority by the miracles he performed, and also to rescue the Messianic people from their bondage in Egypt. And the miracles in between that as well, like for instance, the flood, it was a very important one. The fall required some miraculous acts. The ground was cursed and certain things happened in the fall. And of course the flood, I believe, it was largely a miraculous act as well, where the whole world was covered by water. So these are sort of very few areas in the Bible where you have the miraculous. And then you have them in the time of Elijah and Elisha, because we have the beginning of the prophetic ministry, because Elijah did some amazing miracles like the prophets of Baal, and where he defeated them, where God brought down fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice and all the water around it. And Elisha did quite a few miracles. So that was the beginning of the prophetic ministry. So you got these definite periods of the Old Testament where you have these miracles, but not that much in between though. But you do have in the prophetic ministry, you have predictive prophecy, which is one very important thing in the New Testament, appeals to the fulfilled prophecies of the Old Testament towards the Messiah. And this is possible because God is the creator of time, and therefore he's not bound by time. That's why he knows the future, because he sees the whole timeline from beginning to end. He's not bound by time the way we are. And of course, there's a 400-year gap in history between the closure of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And of course, the coming of Jesus, where you have God himself taking on human nature. And to authenticate Jesus' ministry, we have loads of miracles. I mean, can you answer this one for me? Those of you who haven't heard my church talks, like what was Jesus' first miraculous act recorded in the Gospels? Now, see, John chapter 2 was the water into wine at Cana, and that's said to be the first sign to the disciples. The word in Greek is semeion, which means sign, but of course, before that, we see in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, He was with God in the beginning. Well, who is the Word here? Well, He's the one who became flesh and dwelt among us. But then it tells us through Him all things were made. Without Him, nothing was made that has been made. So in fact, the Gospels tell us the first miracle Jesus did was the creation of the world. And that's a pretty important miracle because it explains who Jesus is. He is God, because if He's not God, He can't be our Savior. And one function of God was to create the whole universe. But of course, there are plenty of other miracles. I mean, He came through a virginal conception as well. But we see other things as well. Here's the Annunciation to Mary, where Mary had not known humanity, a man, and yet she was able to conceive and give birth to the Messiah. And the incarnation, God taking on human nature. And here, it's a case of God adding human nature to His divine nature. So Jesus is both fully God and fully man. He never lost His divinity, but He added humanity to this. And an article on the website, creation.com/incarnation, a good article to read before Christmas time when people are talking about this time, to just see what it was all about. And we see other things here as well. The virgin conceptions, again, creation.com/virgin. You see all these articles on our website about these very theological topics, not just about creation and evolution. We have these deep theological articles as well on the site. So it's a very useful site to browse through. And let's see a few more of the miracles. See, miracles of nature, that proved His divinity because it showed that Jesus had power over nature. Nature was at His command. And that is only possible because Jesus was the one who created nature. So it did His bidding. He even overcame death, bringing back people to life like Lazarus. And of course, the turning water into wine, the first sign to His disciples, as I mentioned. And of course, the biggest one was to rise from the dead. But other things which are not usually realized is, in fact, the rabbis of His day taught there were 3 messianic miracles that only the Messiah would be able to do, including healing someone who is possessed by a demon that caused deafness and curing a man who was born blind. Those are miracles the rabbis had said only the Messiah could do. He did those miracles, and yet He was still rejected. And that is the reason that they had no excuse for what was going to happen to them, because they rejected their own teachings. And of course, He appeared to 500 people at once after his resurrection to show that He was who He said He was. And we've got loads of articles show about the resurrection, like creation.com/res. Now, of course, one motivation for all of us when it comes to miracles and any other thing that we're trying to defend about the faith is to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that is in you. We're supposed to have reasons for our faith. It's not a blind faith. We are meant to have good reasons to share it with other people. See, emotions aren't enough. You see, we can't share our emotions. We can only share the reasons, the evidence that we have. And the other side to this coin is not only sharing positive things, but also to demolish the opposing arguments. The arguments like evolution, the arguments that say miracles can't happen. And that's why we have these books like the Creation Answers book, to do all these things, answering all these questions. Even every time I do a Q&A time, even at universities and other countries, these are the questions that keep on coming up in Q&A times. Now let's look about, if I'm talking about miracles and the laws of nature, well, here's what we need to talk about. What do the laws of nature mean? You see, here's a map here. See, I'd say that the laws of nature are our descriptions of the way God normally upholds his creation. These are the normal, observable, repeatable ways that God upholds his creation that we can investigate. But in fact, the laws of nature are still how God upholds things. We call them laws, but they're really not laws as such. You see, the analogy I like to use is the map here. The map doesn't cause the shape of the coastline. It describes the coastline that is already there. And that's what I believe the laws of nature are doing. They're describing the way God upholds things. God upholds things in an orderly manner. That's an important thing. That's what led to modern science, as I mentioned in my previous talk. And to talk about miracles as violating the laws of nature is to misunderstand what the laws of nature really are. See, here is a Christian philosopher, Norman Geisler, who says that natural law is a description of the way God acts regularly in and through creation, whereas a miracle is the way God acts on special occasions. That natural law describes a gradual activity of God in the world, whereas miracles manifest his immediate actions. So everything is God's working through, is God's working, but not everything is a miracle. You see, if you use the word miracle too broadly, then of course it loses its meaning. That's why I prefer not to say things like an ordinary childbirth is a miracle, because they happen all the time. You see, by definition, a miracle has to be a rare thing, not a common thing. Even though, of course, I believe God is in control during the normal childbirth process. Now, one of the big arguments against the miracles comes from the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the period which they like to call the Enlightenment, which I call the Endarkenment. Because the Endarkenment was a time when they rejected God's revelation in favor of autonomous human reasoning divorced from the Word of God. That was a big problem. It's a downhill step. See, Hume's argument against miracles has never really been improved upon by philosophers ever since. They're still basically rehashing Hume's old argument. So let's have a go at refuting that one. He claims we have uniform experience against miracles. And miracles are exceptions to natural laws that have no exceptions. That's his argument. That's the argument Dawkins and co. use. But the point is it becomes a circular argument, because how do we know this? See, how do we know that there are no exceptions to the laws of nature unless we already know that the reports against them are false? So you see why they're assuming what they need to prove, that the reports about miracles are false, because they know that they must be false. So the silly thing is, they don't trust the Bible because the Bible records miracles. But why don't they trust the Bible? Because it records miracles which can't happen. You see, that's not a real argument, because the trustworthiness of the Bible must be established by other means, which I'll go into a bit later in my talk here. So let's turn the argument back on the atheist, though, because, I mean, why should the atheist be able to refer to natural laws? What justification is there under an atheist philosophy for the idea of natural law? If you remember from my last talk, I think you'll see the point I'm making here. So here's Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist of all time. He had no problem believing that miracles happened. He wrote far more about defending the Bible as a work of accurate history than he wrote about science. See, what the point is, you see, modern science, the idea of scientific laws depends on the assumption that the universe was made by a rational creator. So how does the atheist justify natural laws? Because if atheism is true, there's no reason to believe that the universe should be regular in the first place. So on what basis, under their own assumptions, can they reject miracles as violating a law, the regularity of nature, which they can't justify themselves? Only the Christian can justify regularity in nature and miracles as an addition to that regularity. The atheist chops off the branch he's sitting on. And another thing about the so-called natural laws is they must be defined right as well, because they work in what we call isolated systems. You may have heard Carl's talk about the laws of thermodynamics and isolated systems, but I'll explain it hopefully fairly simply. See, for instance, here's old Newton, the first law of motion. It says that objects will continue in a straight line at constant speed. That's what Newton's law says. But only if no unbalanced force is operating. Otherwise, nothing could ever change direction. But see, you can't say that an object changing direction is really violating that law. The law applies all the time. But the point is, it only applies if nothing else is acting. It can't prohibit an unbalanced force acting. It only says what happens if there is no unbalanced force acting. You see what I mean about the need to specify an isolated system? It can't rule out. It can't prove an isolated system. It assumes an isolated system to work, but it can't actually rule out other things interacting from outside that system. And to apply this to refuting an atheist, one atheist was thinking of Jesus walking on water, and he said this couldn't have happened because we know of Archimedes' principles. Archimedes says, if you want to be technical, that the buoyant force is equal to the volume of the liquid displaced, okay? And obviously, Jesus as a man is denser than water, so Archimedes' principle says he couldn't walk on water. And he thought he was very, very clever trying to use science against the miracles of the Bible. But this is actually a complete mistake, because as I said, the Archimedes' principle is only talking about buoyancy and weight, but it doesn't prohibit something else from acting. I mean, this is William Barclay, who wrote a lot of commentaries on the New Testament. He was quite skeptical of miracles. I think he's quite a dangerous man, actually, because he was far too enamored with modern science and therefore was far too willing to explain away the miracles of the Bible, of the New Testament. The point is, here's an example of where someone can walk on water if he's got a helicopter supporting him. You see, the idea that someone will sink if he's heavier than water is, again, only true if no other forces are acting. If it's just the man and the water, well, yes, he will sink. But does Archimedes' principle rule out a helicopter rescue? So there's no violation here. And of course, Jesus, as the creator of the universe, is perfectly capable of applying an additional force to the system. And therefore, he really can walk on water because he's capable of bringing other forces into play that will keep him buoyant. And he was doing that to the Apostle Peter before Peter lost faith as well. So again, the so-called clever arguments really ignore the fact that a God is not restricted by the universe he created. He's not restricted by time or energy or space or matter. So therefore, when you realize that we do have a creator God, there is no such thing as an isolated system, because God can always intervene. And therefore, there's no basis for disallowing miracles on scientific grounds when you realize how limited science is to the idea of an isolated system. And you cannot say there is an isolated system because of who he is. So in fact, again, the atheist argument against miracles is presupposing atheism to make the argument. So it is not proving atheism, it's assuming atheism. And again, that's what he calls circular reasoning, begging the question. And just to remind you what I said before about what a miracle really was, it was an addition to the system. That's the very helpful way of doing it, not violating, but adding to the system. See, C.S. Lewis wrote a very good book on miracles, again, making this very good point. And you see, C.S. Lewis basically makes all the liberal theologians crumble. Their arguments crumble just from C.S. Lewis's book alone. See, he talked about the incarnation, the virginal conception. You see, Mary certainly provided genetic material because Jesus was our kinsman redeemer. He must have been our blood relative. Therefore, he must have been a physical descendant from Mary. I know there are some people who disagree, but I can't see how you get the kinsman redeemer. He is a physical descendant of Mary, of David, of Abraham, of Adam. That is essential for our salvation. But what happened during the virginal conception was that God made the male genetics and fertilized Mary's egg. But after that, after that addition to the system that Jesus developed as a normal embryo would. So again, it's an addition, not a violation. Because I believe Jesus' birth was an ordinary birth. I mean, people talk about the virgin birth, and Mary was still a virgin when he was born, but there wasn't anything miraculous about the birth. The miraculous act was the conception of Jesus, not the birth of Jesus. Now, how about the idea, I've mentioned that because of God being outside science, that miracles aren't violated by science. They're an addition to science. But then the argument from the atheists that I've come across fairly recently is what would stop miracles happening in a science lab? Could we do science if God was capricious enough to interfere with the results of your experiment? But again, this depends on what sort of God we believe in. We believe in a God of order once again. You see, this would be a good argument against the gods of Zeus or the New Age philosophy where the gods are capricious, but it's not an argument against the God of the Bible who did things for a good reason. His miracles were there to authenticate certain things. Jesus on earth, Moses, the prophets, not just for a whim. See, when you compare the Gospels with the counterfeit Gospels that came 100 or 200 years later, you can see the difference in quality there. The counterfeit Gospels had just capricious miracles, no rhyme or reason behind them. So they were therefore counterfeit Gospels, not authentic ones. And then the other thing is, if we believe the Christian miracle reports, why shouldn't we believe the Book of Mormon? And that's not a very good argument, really, though, because it's like saying because one politician's promises can be trusted, everyone else's politicians should be trusted too, which we might have a few disagreements about. But the thing is, the point is that the Christian miracles have good evidence behind them. The Mormon miracles are counterfeit ones. Or imagination of Joseph Smith, who had a very vivid imagination. So the thing is, this argument only applies if the evidence is equal for both classes, but that's what, again, they have to prove instead of assuming what they need to prove. You see, there are a lot of hoax miracles, therefore there aren't any true miracles. Again, a false argument. So because we have counterfeit money, there can't be any real money. But in fact, I'd go even further and say because you have counterfeits, there's something to counterfeit. You wouldn't counterfeit something which is not real. You counterfeit something that is real. And that's what we have with the counterfeit miracles. They're the fake copy of something which is real. But there is a point as a matter of caution, though. There are some miracles, but they're not from God. And see, the Bible is very clear about this. You see, in Deuteronomy, a very important passage of a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a miraculous sign or wonder, and in that sign or wonder of which he has spoken takes place, and he says, let's follow other gods you have not known, and worship them. You must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The Lord your God is testing you to see whether you love him with all your heart and all your soul. So the point about this is that the Bible must be the way we judge true miracles from false miracles. See, this passage points to the supremacy of Scripture over miraculous claims. Because a miraculous claim that contradicts what the Word of God says is a counterfeit miracle. It is not a genuine one. And this applies to the claims of the alien abductions and all those sort of things. We must judge miracles and experience by God's Word, the Bible. Then, of course, the question is the Bible a reliable guide? Now, of course, we would say the Bible is something we accept as true, but are there ways we can defend it? Well, let's look at some of these things. Here's John Warwick Montgomery, who got dozens of degrees, got lots of degrees, I think 7 degrees, a very clever man, a lawyer, a linguist, all sorts of things, a great apologist. And he gave these tests of how you can judge the Bible by comparing it with how we judge other historical documents. See, if we throw out the Bible as he shows, you have to throw out just about everything else in history as well. Now, for one thing, what we call internal evidence tests, we should give the benefit of the doubt to the document before we give it to the critic. You see, so much in the way of things like Jesus' seminar and the other liberal theological attacks on the Bible, they give the benefit of the doubt to the critics instead of trusting the Bible as innocent until proven guilty. The document should be trusted unless it's proven wrong, not doubted for its own sake. And then we've got external evidence. In fact, the Bible has loads of evidence from outside sources to the Old Testament and the New Testament. We have loads of people, outside people like Josephus and Thallus and Tacitus, Suetonius, affirming the essential truth of Jesus and the Gospels. See, his existence was not doubted by his friends or his enemies, nor were the miracle claims doubted. In fact, the anti-Christian Jewish sources tried to explain away Jesus' miracles. They didn't doubt they occurred, though. Now, what about authenticity? And see, authenticity really means something. Is what we have today what was originally written? See, authentic by itself doesn't mean true or false. It means how does it match up with what was originally written, or has it been corrupted? See, what I've got here is the earliest example of the gospel of the New Testament is the John Ryland's manuscript called P52, and it's about 125 AD. It's really, really early. Now, when you compare things like Homer and the Iliad, Odyssey from Homer, and Julius Caesar's works, the works of Plato, usually the earliest manuscripts we have of those is thousands of years after the original was written. But the New Testament, we've got something which is probably about 35 years after it was written. So by historical standard, this is incredibly close to the original. So again, if we throw out this one, nothing else can be believed, and no classical scholar would give that idea a time of day. The classical scholars, as opposed to the liberal theologians, are envious of the amazing evidence for the New Testament from the manuscript we have available. About 5,000 Greek manuscripts. We've got translations into other languages. We've got quotations from the church fathers. All these things show that what we have is incredibly close to what the originals say. But then the other idea is not just do we have something close to the originals, but also do the originals tell the truth? Now again, this is Simon Greenleaf, and he was a legal scholar of the testing of witnesses in courts. How do we judge a witness to be reliable? And there are various things that they would do. The honesty that we can tell from their lives, how able they are, whether they're capable of doing these things. See, when you look at the New Testament writers and the Bible writers in general, you compare it to things like the Pharaoh's writing, the Hittites' writing, which always blew up how wonderful their rulers were, never admitted the faults of anyone. But you look at the Bible, it's very honest about the faults of people. Even the heroes, Noah got drunk and Moses disobeyed God so he wouldn't get to the promised land. You have David committing terrible sins. Jesus' disciples being very basically thick. They're so slow on the uptake that Jesus was frustrated by them. There's squabbling between them. See, all these things reflect honesty. They were self-critical. I mean, Peter inspired, basically, sorry, not inspired, but he actually was overseeing Mark's gospel. And you see how critical Mark is of Peter in the gospel. So they're very honest about pointing out the faults they had. So it's a very good evidence they were honest people. And also, when you think of the apostles, how they most of them died pretty horrible deaths for their faith. And you see, people can be tortured for a delusion, but these guys, if they were tortured for what they know was a lie, that's unprecedented. I mean, they must have known that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, they must have known it. And someone would have spilled the beans under torture and death. But it didn't happen. They went to their deaths for what they believed was true. And the ability of things, when you think of Luke as a great historian, I mean, Sir William Ramsay said that after trying to disprove Luke, he realized that Luke was a great historian on the par of people like Herodotus, because he checked him out, all the different names of rulers he found. And they matched up time and time again. And you see Luke's, how careful Luke was to try to match things up with the times of the emperors, various rulers around the place. Just these guys knew what they were doing. Paul was a great scholar, fluent in probably 3 languages, schooled by Rabbi Gamaliel himself. Matthew was a tax collector, and he knew how to do maths. And you can tell there's a lot of mathematical stuff in Matthew's gospel. And so they knew what they were talking about. And also the idea you got the Gospels, 4 Gospels, different accounts from different perspectives. See, if they were all the same, you'd think they were colluding with each other, but it's enough different perspectives of the same events which give you an overall picture of the truth, but enough to say there wasn't any collusion. And they also conform to other people writing about the same issues. People who had no reason to believe these guys were true, but had to affirm that what they were saying was true. Now, the last thing I wanted to deal with is the idea that the biblical miracles were copied from pagan miracles. I'll go through a few points briefly about that. That somehow Christianity was copied from paganism. And certainly back in New Zealand, where I grew up, there's a man, Lloyd Gearing, who was basically the leading liberal theologian of New Zealand, and he said that Christianity was derived from the Mithraism. You may have heard that in some of the skeptical gutter sites on the internet. But the problem is, as you can see in this, there's an article I wrote on this one called Copycat, creation.com/copycats. You see, it's not, again, all this the general Christian apologetics material is easy to find on our website. So some points. Who derived from whom? So when you look at things like Mithraism, that the Mithra claims, doctrines, as it were, that supposedly Christianity borrowed from are not found until hundreds of years after Christ. So obviously, Mithraism couldn't have been the source of the Christian miracles, but rather Christianity was the source and Mithra was the counterfeit. Also, back in the Old Testament, a lot of the liberals want to say that Noah came from the Gilgamesh epic. But once again, it seems obvious the Gilgamesh epic was the counterfeit. I mean, here's one reason. Look at the ark they had. See, the Gilgamesh epic had a ridiculous cubical ark, which is a ridiculous shape because it would capsize, roll over. But think about it. The Bible's ark was an incredibly seaworthy vessel. But when legends developed, a cube with one dimension is easier to remember than 3 dimensions of the real ark. So clearly the Gilgamesh ark is the counterfeit. It's clearly the legend, not the original. And this applies over and over again. I mean, the 25th of December date supposed for Jesus' birth. I'm not saying he was or wasn't born that day. But once again, the pagan idea of Sol Invictus and the Roman celebrations post-dated the earliest known Christian celebrations of that 25th of December date. So once again, it's the pagans that were the copies, not the original. And then, are the parallels genuine? So just think about things like the virginal conception. You see, people have talked about certain things like Perseus, who was conceived because Zeus was a randy fellow who liked human mortals. But that was a God having intercourse with a human woman. It wasn't a virginal conception at all. And all these supposed virginal conceptions are not anything of the sort. Same with resurrection. You find Jesus rose from the dead and then ascended to the right hand of God the Father. The other supposed resurrection are always cyclical things which go with the seasons. Or you have Osiris in the Egyptian pantheon, who basically was dead and the god of the underworld. He didn't rise up from the dead. He stayed in the underworld. Quite a different thing from Jesus who conquered death and appeared to 500 people and rose up. In history, again, a completely different thing from the pagan parallels. So when you look at it into more depth, you find these pagan parallels are not parallels at all. And the other thing is that Christ was a historical figure. You might have heard of some of these things on skeptic websites about 16 crucified saviors, but see, none of these saviors were even remotely thought of as being historical figures. But Jesus was a historical figure. He was written about by people who knew him personally, unlike the pagan accounts. Well, long ago, so such and such happened. Not claiming to have seen the guy, but Jesus was written about by people who saw him. They knew him. They spent 3 years together. They had the Last Supper together. Jesus was real to them and to his enemies as well. And one last thing, obviously, the Christians were Jews. They were not pagans. They hated paganism. You think of Paul and Barnabas, and the inhabitants thought they were Greek gods, and they tore their clothes in horror. They were just horrified that they were mistaken for God. They had this abhorrence for paganism. The idea that somehow they would have copied these false religions they had contempt for, it just doesn't make any sense from that perspective either. So, and another thing about defending the Bible, the book that we recently come out, Christianity for Skeptics, has a big chapter on the reliability of the Bible, and it has some material on why we can trust the miracles of Christ and the resurrection. So this book is probably one of the more relevant ones for the talk I've given tonight. Now, one last thing I want to do is this idea of chronological snobbery. Somehow it's quite common among the critics to actually attack the Christians of the past because they were primitive. They didn't know as much as we do. We are so much more intelligent than they are. See, here is one of the arguments that might come up here, you see. They didn't know about the facts of life, the birds and the bees, the sperm and the ovum, so of course they could believe in virgin births. But we know better today. But the thing, you look at the gospel accounts, is that they were as skeptical as we are. You see, Mary asked, how can this be? I don't know a man. She knew very well the facts of life. Even if she didn't know the fine details, she certainly knew it took a man to produce a baby. And Joseph, he was going to divorce Mary because if she was pregnant, she must have been with another man. Until an angel came to tell them, no, this is not what it was. But you see, they knew very well as we do, that men are required to have babies. So that's the thing. They question these accounts because they did know perfectly well the facts of life. They did know that dead men don't rise. Well, for instance, look at the account of Lazarus and Jesus when Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Again, the friends said, well, you shouldn't go there because he's going to stink by now. They knew what happened to dead bodies normally. They weren't stupid. They didn't know things like how bacteria decarboxylate amino acids and produce diamines like putrescine and cadaverine. Okay, they didn't know that sort of stuff, but they knew these things stink. And the other idea is somehow ancients were more gullible than the moderns. And once again, I showed you that they're not more gullible. They knew the facts of life. But then we've got horoscopes in every newspaper today, haven't we? You're talking about gullibility. And the thing is, as I say, the ancients were quite skeptical of miracles because they were very rare things. And evolution, people believe in evolution, that things came from pond scum. And they call Christians gullible. Good grief. And here's another point. Is the Bible miracle accounts are myths and not history. But again, C.S. Lewis was actually, before he was a Christian apologist, he was actually a scholar of literature. He knew what myths looked like, and he challenged these liberal theologians. Try and read a myth, and you'll see the difference between the myths and what the Bible, the New Testament, the whole Bible talks about. The Bible does not have the characteristics of myth. He was more of a New Testament man, and he couldn't find any trace of myths in the New Testament, but we could see in the development of the counterfeit Gospels how myths could grow. And again, read the counterfeit gospels and compare them with the real ones. And once again, you've got the comparison, but the liberal theologians just don't seem to have this comparison. And the only reason they believe the New Testament is myth is because it has miracles in. But they don't trust the miracles because it's a myth, you see. So again, round and round in a circle they go. I mean, that's the thing with the Jesus Seminar, because when you look at the way the newspapers report the Jesus Seminar as conclusions, but then you look at what they actually did, those conclusions were actually the premises. They actually, before they looked at the evidence themselves, they assumed there weren't any miracles, that miracle reports are false. But then newspapers report them as saying, oh, these guys have proved there weren't miracles in the Gospels. They assumed that to start with, though. It will must be a miracle if they actually found miracles with that assumption. So let's look at how to conclude from here, some take-away home points here. And don't forget our website. The Bible tells of many miracles, and the most important ones are creation and the resurrection of Christ, because that's important for our salvation. And the philosophical objections of people like Hume and all the atheists today, they are guilty of circular reason. They assume the impossibility of miracles to prove the impossibility of miracles. What else can we say? That miracles are exceptions or additions to natural laws, but natural laws only make sense in a biblical creationist framework. No other framework can even justify the idea of natural laws and regular, repeatable way the universe is upheld. And they're good historical and legal grounds for believing the Bible's miracle reports.